Welcome to this module on pollination, biodiversity, and climate change. When most people think about pollination, they imagine a bee visiting a flower. While that image is familiar and important, it represents only a small part of a much larger story. Pollination is one of the most essential ecological processes on Earth. It supports the reproduction of flowering plants, sustains biodiversity, enables agricultural production, and ultimately helps feed billions of people. In this lesson, we will explore pollination not as an isolated event, but as a living ecological system. We will examine how plants, pollinators, climate, landscapes, and evolutionary processes interact to create resilient ecological networks. We will also see how climate change is affecting these relationships and why understanding ecological connections is becoming increasingly important for biodiversity, food security, and human well-being. By the end of this module, you will understand why the real unit of analysis is not the bee or the flower alone, but the network of relationships that connects them. Let us begin. Before we begin exploring pollination networks and climate change, let us take a moment to review the learning objectives for this module. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to explain why pollination is one of the most important ecological processes on Earth and why it plays such a critical role in supporting biodiversity, agriculture, and food security. You will learn to view pollination not simply as the transfer of pollen between flowers, but as a network of interconnected relationships involving plants, pollinators, habitats, climate, and ecological processes. We will examine how biodiversity contributes to ecological resilience and explore why diverse ecosystems are often better able to absorb disturbances and adapt to change. You will become familiar with important concepts such as redundancy, modularity, and interaction diversity, and understand how these characteristics strengthen ecological networks. We will also investigate how climate change affects pollination systems through changes in temperature, seasonal timing, species distributions, and ecological relationships. Finally, you will apply systems thinking to understand how ecosystems function as interconnected networks and why healthy pollination systems are essential for both environmental sustainability and human well-being. As we move through the lesson, keep these objectives in mind. Together, they will help us understand how pollination connects biodiversity, climate resilience, and food security into a single living system. Why does pollination matter? The answer is simple. Much of the food we eat depends on it. Scientists estimate that approximately 75% of the world's major crop species benefit from animal pollination. This means that many fruits, vegetables, nuts, oilseed crops, coffee, and cocoa rely, at least in part, on animals to transfer pollen between flowers. When pollination occurs successfully, plants produce seeds and fruits more effectively. This increases both crop yields and crop quality. Think about some of the foods shown on this slide. Apples, berries, nuts, coffee, cocoa, and many vegetables all depend on pollinators to varying degrees. Without pollination, harvests would decline, food choices would become more limited, and nutritional diversity could be reduced. Pollination, therefore, supports much more than individual plants. It helps sustain agriculture, food security, rural livelihoods, and human nutrition. Every time a pollinator visits a flower, it contributes to a process that ultimately connects ecosystems to our dinner tables. This is why pollination is considered one of the most valuable ecosystem services provided by nature. At first glance, pollination appears to be a very simple process. A bee visits a flower, collects nectar or pollen, transfers pollen between flowers, and eventually a fruit develops. This sequence is correct, and it is how many people understand pollination. However, this view tells only part of the story. Behind every successful pollination event lies a much larger ecological system. The bee depends on suitable habitat, favorable weather, seasonal flowering patterns, and access to food resources throughout its life cycle. The plant depends on healthy pollinator populations, appropriate environmental conditions, and successful reproduction over many generations. If any of these supporting elements are disrupted, pollination may become less effective, even if flowers and pollinators are still present. In other words, pollination is not simply a bee visiting a flower. It is the outcome of countless interactions among living organisms and their environment. To truly understand pollination, we must move beyond individual species and begin examining the ecological networks that connect them. That systems perspective is the focus of the rest of this module. Now let us expand our perspective and view pollination as a living system. Pollination does not occur in isolation. It emerges from the interactions among many different components that are continuously influencing one another. At the center of this system are the pollinators: bees, butterflies, birds, bats, flies, beetles, and many other organisms that transfer pollen between flowers. But pollinators do not act alone. They depend on plant communities that provide nectar, pollen, and habitat. Plants, in turn, depend on pollinators for successful reproduction. Both plants and pollinators are influenced by climate. Temperature, rainfall, humidity, and seasonal weather patterns affect flowering times, pollinator activity, migration, and survival. The landscape also plays an important role. Forests, meadows, farms, hedgerows, and natural habitats determine where pollinators can live, feed, and move across the environment. Seasonality adds another layer of complexity. Flowering periods and pollinator life cycles must remain synchronized so that food resources are available when they are needed. Finally, evolution has shaped these relationships over millions of years. Plants and pollinators have adapted to one another through a long process of co-evolution, creating specialized partnerships and ecological networks. When all these components interact successfully, pollination emerges as a system-level outcome. This is why pollination is best understood not as a single event, but as a dynamic network of relationships connecting organisms, environments, and ecological processes. When people hear the word pollinator, they often think immediately of bees. Bees are certainly among the most important pollinators, but they are only one part of a much larger pollinator community. Across ecosystems around the world, many different groups of animals contribute to pollination. These include butterflies, moths, beetles, flies, birds, bats, and numerous other organisms. Each group occupies a distinct ecological niche and contributes differently to ecosystem functioning. Bees are highly efficient pollinators and are responsible for pollinating many agricultural crops and wild plants. Butterflies and moths often pollinate flowers with long floral tubes. Beetles are among the oldest pollinators in evolutionary history. Flies can be important pollinators in cooler environments and at higher elevations. Birds, such as hummingbirds, pollinate many flowering plants, particularly in tropical and subtropical regions. Bats play a critical role in pollinating numerous night-blooming plants, including species that produce fruits and other economically important products. The key point is that pollination is not dependent on a single species or even a single group of organisms. Instead, ecosystems rely on a diverse community of pollinators, each contributing unique capabilities, behaviors, and ecological functions. This diversity helps strengthen pollination networks and provides the foundation for resilience when environmental conditions change. Not all plants rely on animals for pollination. Many species use a very different strategy known as wind pollination. Instead of attracting bees, butterflies, birds, or bats, these plants release large quantities of pollen into the air and depend on the wind to carry it to other flowers. Wind pollination may seem inefficient because much of the pollen never reaches its destination. However, in dense plant populations, it can be remarkably effective. Many grasses, cereals, sedges, rushes, and temperate forest trees use this approach. Some of the world's most important food crops, including wheat, rice, maize, and other grains, are wind pollinated. You may notice that wind pollinated plants often look different from animal pollinated flowers. They usually produce little nectar, have less colorful flowers, and invest their energy in producing abundant pollen rather than attracting pollinators. Animal pollination and wind pollination therefore represent two distinct evolutionary solutions to the same biological challenge, transferring pollen from one flower to another. Together, these strategies support plant reproduction across a wide range of ecosystems. Understanding both forms of pollination helps us appreciate the diversity of mechanisms that sustain biodiversity, agriculture, and food production around the world. To understand pollination networks, we must travel back through evolutionary time. For more than 100 million years, flowering plants and pollinators have influenced each other's evolution through a process known as coevolution. Coevolution occurs when two groups of organisms adapt in response to one another over many generations. As flowering plants evolved, they developed features that helped attract pollinators. Flowers acquired bright colors, distinctive fragrances, nectar rewards, specialized shapes, and flowering schedules that increased the likelihood of successful pollination. At the same time, pollinators evolved traits that helped them access these resources more efficiently. Different species developed specialized mouthparts, body shapes, sensory abilities, and behaviors that allowed them to locate and utilize particular flowers. Some relationships became highly specialized. Certain orchids, for example, can only be pollinated by specific insects. Likewise, some pollinators depend heavily on particular plant species for food and reproduction. Other relationships remained more general, with many pollinators visiting many different flowers. Over millions of years, these countless interactions created complex ecological networks linking plants and pollinators across entire ecosystems. The important point is that pollination networks are not random collections of species. They are the result of long-term evolutionary partnerships that have developed through continuous adaptation and mutual influence. These co-evolved relationships form the biological foundation upon which modern ecosystems and agricultural systems depend. We have seen that pollination systems are networks of relationships rather than collections of individual species. The next question is, why does this matter? The answer lies in a concept known as ecological resilience. Resilience is the ability of a system to absorb disturbances, adapt to change, and continue functioning despite challenges. In pollination networks, resilience depends largely on diversity, redundancy, and connectivity. Many plants are visited by multiple pollinator species rather than relying on a single pollinator. Likewise, many pollinators visit a variety of flowering plants. This creates what ecologists call functional overlap. Different species can sometimes perform similar ecological roles. Consider a tomato plant. Bumblebees are among its most effective pollinators because they use a technique called buzz pollination, vibrating the flower to release pollen. However, tomatoes may also be visited by other insects and bee species. If one pollinator population declines because of disease, habitat loss, pesticide exposure, or climatic stress, other pollinators may continue providing at least part of the pollination service. The same principle operates across entire ecosystems. In a meadow, dozens of flowering plants may be visited by bees, butterflies, moths, flies, and beetles. Some pollinators are active in the morning, others in the afternoon. Some are most abundant in spring, while others dominate during summer or even at night. Because multiple species contribute to pollination, the system is not entirely dependent on any single organism. This diversity acts as a form of ecological insurance. When disturbances occur, alternative pathways often allow pollination to continue. In this way, resilience emerges not from the survival of individual species alone, but from the strength and diversity of the network that connects them. That is why biodiversity is more than a measure of ecological richness. It is one of the foundations of ecosystem stability and resilience. Let us examine a practical example of resilience in action. Consider a tomato plant. Tomato flowers are unusual because they are most efficiently pollinated through a process called buzz pollination. In this process, a bee grips the flower and rapidly vibrates its flight muscles. These vibrations shake pollen loose from the flower, making pollination highly effective. Bumblebees are particularly well adapted for this task and are often considered the most efficient pollinators of tomatoes. At first glance, this might suggest that tomato production depends entirely on bumblebees. However, the reality is more complex. Tomato flowers may also be visited by other bee species and insects. While these alternative pollinators may not be as efficient as bumblebees, they can still contribute to pollen transfer and fruit production. Now imagine that a disease outbreak, habitat loss, pesticide exposure, or climatic stress causes a decline in local bumblebee populations. If tomatoes depended exclusively on bumblebees, pollination services could collapse. But because other pollinators are also present, at least part of the pollination function can continue. Crop yields may decline somewhat, and pollination may become less efficient, but the system continues to operate. This is an example of ecological redundancy. Multiple species contribute to the same ecological function, providing a backup system when conditions change. The tomato example illustrates a broader principle found throughout nature. Ecosystems become more resilient when they contain overlapping functions and multiple pathways for maintaining essential processes. In other words, resilience comes not from dependence on a single species, but from the diversity of relationships that connect many species together. Let us now scale up from a single tomato plant to an entire meadow ecosystem. Imagine a meadow filled with dozens of flowering plant species. Throughout the growing season, these flowers attract a wide variety of pollinators, including bees, butterflies, moths, flies, and beetles. At first glance, this may appear to be a collection of independent species. In reality, it is a highly interconnected ecological network. Different pollinators perform their activities at different times and under different environmental conditions. Some bees are most active during cool morning hours. Other insects become more active during warmer afternoons. Butterflies may visit flowers during the day, while many moths pollinate flowers at night. Seasonal differences also contribute to resilience. Some pollinator species are abundant in spring, while others reach peak activity during summer or early autumn. Because many plant species are visited by multiple pollinators and many pollinators visit multiple plants, the meadow contains a large number of overlapping ecological relationships. Now consider what happens when a disturbance occurs. A drought may reduce the population of one pollinator group. An extreme weather event may affect the flowering of certain plant species. Disease may temporarily reduce the abundance of another pollinator. In a simplified ecosystem with very few species, such disturbances could severely disrupt pollination. But in a diverse meadow, alternative pollinators and alternative plant relationships often remain available. The network adjusts and continues functioning. This is resilience at the ecosystem level. The stability of the meadow does not depend on any single species. Instead, it emerges from the diversity of organisms and, more importantly, from the diversity of relationships that connect them. The meadow illustrates a fundamental principle of ecology. Healthy ecosystems are supported by networks of interactions, not by individual species acting alone. Let us now examine a real-world agricultural example. California's almond orchards produce the majority of the world's almonds and represent one of the largest pollination-dependent agricultural systems on Earth. Each year, millions of almond trees bloom over a relatively short period. During this brief flowering season, successful pollination is essential for producing a profitable harvest. For many years, managed honeybees have been considered the primary pollinators of almond orchards. Beekeepers transport large numbers of honeybee colonies into the orchards specifically to support pollination. At first glance, this might suggest that almond production depends almost entirely on honeybees. However, research has shown that the story is more complex. Wild pollinators, including native bees and other insects, also contribute significantly to almond pollination. In many cases, the presence of wild pollinators improves pollination efficiency and can even increase crop yields. Why is this important? Because honeybee populations can be affected by disease, parasites, pesticide exposure, habitat loss, and climatic stress. If agricultural systems depend on a single pollinator species, they become more vulnerable to disruption. The presence of diverse wild pollinators provides an important backup system. When honeybee populations are weakened, native pollinators can continue contributing to pollination services. This is another example of resilience through diversity. The productivity of almond orchards depends not only on the health of honeybees, but on the strength and diversity of the entire pollinator community. The lesson extends far beyond almonds. Agricultural resilience often depends on maintaining biodiversity both within farms and in the surrounding landscapes that support pollinator populations. In this way, natural ecosystems and agricultural systems are closely connected through the pollination networks they share. So far, we have seen that pollination systems function as networks of interconnected relationships. But these networks are not completely uniform. Research shows that pollination systems are often organized into smaller, partially independent groups known as modules. A module is a cluster of species that interact more frequently with one another than with the rest of the network. For example, some plants may interact primarily with bees, while others are more closely associated with birds, bats, flies, or moths. These groups form semi-independent subnetworks within the larger pollination system. You can think of modularity as similar to compartments within a ship. If water enters one compartment, the entire ship does not immediately flood because the compartments help contain the damage. Pollination networks work in a similar way. If a disturbance affects one group of species, such as a disease that reduces a particular pollinator population, the effects may remain largely confined to that part of the network rather than spreading everywhere. This structure helps increase resilience. Because different modules maintain some degree of independence, ecosystems are often better able to absorb disturbances without experiencing complete system failure. At the same time, the modules remain connected to the broader network, allowing energy, resources, and ecological functions to continue flowing through the system. From a systems perspective, modularity represents another important mechanism that helps ecosystems remain stable in a changing world. It is one more reason why the structure of ecological relationships is just as important as the number of species present. When discussing biodiversity, we often focus on the number of species present in an ecosystem. However, ecologists increasingly recognize that another factor may be just as important: interaction diversity. Interaction diversity refers to the variety of ecological relationships within a network. In a pollination system, these relationships are the connections between plants and pollinators. To understand why this matters, imagine two different meadows. The first meadow contains 50 pollinator species, but each species visits only one or two plant species. The network contains many species, but relatively few connections. The second meadow contains only 30 pollinator species. However, each pollinator visits multiple flowering plants, and each plant is visited by multiple pollinators. Although the second meadow has fewer species, it contains a much richer web of interactions. Now imagine that one pollinator species disappears. In the first meadow, some plants may lose their only pollinator, causing pollination services to break down. In the second meadow, other pollinators can often continue visiting the same plants. The network remains functional because multiple relationships overlap. This is why interaction diversity contributes so strongly to resilience. The more connections that exist within a network, the more alternative pathways are available when disturbances occur. You can think of it like a transportation system. A city connected by many roads, bridges, and alternative routes can continue functioning even when one route is blocked. A city dependent on a single road is much more vulnerable to disruption. Pollination networks operate in much the same way. From a systems perspective, resilience emerges not only from the number of species present, but from the density and diversity of the relationships linking them together. In many ecosystems, it is these relationships that form the true foundation of ecological stability. So far, we have explored how pollination networks develop resilience through diversity, redundancy, connectivity, and adaptation. For millions of years, these ecological networks evolved under relatively stable climatic conditions. Plants and pollinators synchronize their life cycles with seasonal patterns of temperature, rainfall, and daylight. Flowering periods, migration routes, breeding cycles, and pollinator activity became closely aligned through long-term evolution. Today, however, a new challenge is emerging. Climate change is altering the environmental conditions upon which these relationships depend. Average temperatures are rising, rainfall patterns are becoming less predictable, extreme weather events are becoming more frequent in many regions. Droughts, heat waves, floods, storms, and changing seasons are affecting ecosystems around the world. Importantly, climate change does not affect plants and pollinators separately. It affects the relationships that connect them. A flower may bloom earlier than it did in the past. A pollinator may emerge at a different time. A species may shift its geographic range in response to changing temperatures. Habitats that once supported thriving pollinator communities may become less suitable. Individually, these changes may appear small. Collectively, they can begin to weaken the ecological networks that support pollination. This is why climate change is increasingly viewed not simply as an environmental issue, but as a systems-level challenge that affects biodiversity, agriculture, food security, and human well-being. In the next few slides, we will examine how climate change influences pollinators and why protecting pollination networks has become an important part of building resilient ecosystems. One of the most important ways climate change affects pollination networks is through what ecologists call phenological mismatches. Phenology is the study of seasonal biological events. These include flowering, leaf emergence, migration, breeding, and the seasonal activity patterns of pollinators. For millions of years, plants and pollinators evolved under relatively stable climatic conditions. As a result, many of their life cycles became synchronized. When temperatures warmed in spring, flowers bloomed. At roughly the same time, pollinators emerged from hibernation, completed development, or arrived through seasonal migration. This synchronization ensured that pollinators could find food and that plants could receive pollination services. Climate change is now disrupting this timing. Rising temperatures can cause some plants to flower earlier than they did historically. Pollinators may also respond to changing temperatures, but not always at the same rate or in the same way. As a result, flowers and pollinators may become out of sync. Imagine a flowering plant that now blooms 2 weeks earlier than it did in the past. If its primary pollinator emerges according to a different environmental cue, such as day length, the flowers may bloom before the pollinator becomes active. When this happens, plants may receive less pollination, while pollinators may find fewer food resources when they emerge. Neither species has disappeared. The problem lies in the timing of their interaction. From a systems perspective, this is a powerful example of relationship disruption. The plant may still exist, the pollinator may still exist, yet the ecological connection between them has weakened. Scientists have documented phenological mismatches in numerous ecosystems around the world. While some species may adapt to changing conditions, others may struggle to maintain synchrony as climatic changes accelerate. The long-term concern is not simply that individual species are affected. The concern is that the relationships connecting species begin to erode. And as we have seen throughout this module, it is these relationships that form the foundation of resilient pollination networks. Climate change affects pollination networks not only through changes in timing, but also through changes in location. As temperatures rise and environmental conditions change, many species are shifting their geographic ranges in search of suitable habitats. This process is known as a range shift. Across the world, plants and animals are moving toward higher latitudes, higher elevations, or regions with more favorable climatic conditions. For individual species, these movements can be a natural response to environmental change. The challenge arises when interacting species do not move together. A flowering plant may gradually expand its range northward as temperatures increase. Its primary pollinator, however, may be unable to move as quickly because of habitat fragmentation, physical barriers, limited dispersal ability, or differences in environmental requirements. The result is a growing separation between species that once interacted closely. In some cases, pollinators may arrive in a new region before the plants they depend upon. In other cases, plants may establish populations in areas where their most effective pollinators are absent. These disruptions can weaken pollination services and reduce reproductive success for both plants and pollinators. Mountain ecosystems provide a useful example. As temperatures warm, many species move uphill in search of cooler conditions. However, mountains have finite elevations. Species eventually reach the limits of available habitat, leaving them with nowhere else to go. Range shifts can therefore create entirely new ecological communities while simultaneously breaking apart long-established relationships. From a systems perspective, the challenge is not simply that species are moving. Ecosystems have always experienced change. The challenge is that climate change is causing many species to move at different speeds, in different directions, and with different capacities for adaptation. As these movements accelerate, ecological networks may become increasingly fragmented, placing additional stress on pollination systems. Just as phenological mismatches disrupt relationships through time, range shifts disrupt relationships through space. Both processes illustrate a central theme of this module. Climate change threatens not only species, but the ecological connections that bind them together. We have seen that climate change can disrupt ecological relationships through changes in timing and changes in geographic distribution. The next question is, what happens when these disruptions persist over time? The answer is relationship loss. Relationship loss occurs when species that once interacted regularly become disconnected from one another. A flowering plant may lose access to its most effective pollinator. A pollinator may no longer find the plants that provide its primary food source. Over time, interactions that evolved over thousands or even millions of years may weaken or disappear. This is an important idea because ecological systems are built from relationships. When we think about biodiversity, we often focus on the number of species present in an ecosystem. Yet the functioning of an ecosystem depends just as much on the interactions among those species. Imagine a network in which many of the connections gradually disappear. The individual species may still exist, but the network becomes less connected and less resilient. This is similar to a transportation system in which roads, bridges, and rail links are progressively removed. Even if the cities remain in place, movement becomes more difficult and the system becomes more vulnerable to disruption. Pollination networks operate in much the same way. As relationships are lost, pollination services become less reliable. Plants may produce fewer seeds and fruits. Pollinator populations may decline because food resources become less available. The network begins to lose the redundancy and connectivity that previously supported resilience. Scientists increasingly recognize that one of the greatest risks posed by climate change is not simply species extinction, but the erosion of ecological interactions. From a systems perspective, the loss of relationships represents a loss of biological infrastructure. The species may be the visible components of the system, but the relationships are the threads that hold the system together. When those threads begin to unravel, ecosystems become less stable, less adaptable, and less capable of supporting the biodiversity and ecological services upon which both nature and human societies depend. Up to this point, we have focused primarily on ecosystems, pollinators, and ecological networks. Now, let us consider why these networks matter to human societies. Pollination supports many of the crops that contribute to food production around the world. Fruits, vegetables, nuts, oilseeds, coffee, cocoa, and numerous other crops depend to varying degrees on animal pollination. When pollination systems function effectively, plants produce seeds and fruits, crop yields are maintained, and food supplies remain diverse. But when pollination services decline, the effects can extend far beyond individual farms. Reduced pollination may lower crop yields, decrease crop quality, and affect the availability of certain foods. In some cases, farmers may face higher production costs as they attempt to compensate for declining ecosystem services. The impacts are not distributed equally across all foods. Many staple grains such as wheat, rice, and maize are primarily wind-pollinated. However, many of the foods that provide essential vitamins, minerals, healthy fats, and dietary diversity depend heavily on animal pollinators. As a result, declines in pollination can influence not only the quantity of food available, but also its nutritional quality. The consequences may also affect rural livelihoods, agricultural economies, and the resilience of food systems to environmental change. From a systems perspective, pollination represents a critical link in a much larger chain. Healthy pollinator communities support healthy plant communities. Healthy plant communities support agricultural productivity. Agricultural productivity contributes to food security, nutrition, economic stability, and human well-being. This means that pollination is not simply an ecological process. It is part of the biological infrastructure that supports human civilization. When pollination networks are protected, the benefits extend beyond biodiversity. They help sustain the food systems upon which societies depend. Understanding this connection is one of the reasons pollination has become such an important topic in discussions about sustainability, climate resilience, and the future of global food security. Let us conclude by returning to the question with which we began. What is pollination? At first glance, pollination appears to be a simple interaction between a flower and a pollinator. But throughout this module, we have seen that the reality is far more complex. Pollination is best understood as a living ecological network shaped by millions of years of coevolution. Within this network, plants, pollinators, climate, landscapes, and seasonal cycles are connected through countless relationships. These interactions create the conditions that allow ecosystems to reproduce, biodiversity to flourish, and food systems to function. We have also seen that resilience emerges from diversity. Not only the diversity of species, but the diversity of relationships, linking those species together. Redundancy, connectivity, interaction diversity, and modularity all help pollination networks absorb disturbances and continue functioning in the face of change. At the same time, climate change is placing increasing pressure on these networks. Phenological mismatches, range shifts, and the loss of ecological relationships can weaken the connections upon which pollination depends. From a systems perspective, the greatest risk is not simply the loss of individual species. It is the gradual erosion of the ecological relationships that support ecosystem stability and resilience. The central lesson of this module is therefore straightforward. Pollination is not merely a biological process. It is part of the living infrastructure that supports biodiversity, agriculture, food security, nutrition, and human well-being. Protecting pollination networks requires conserving both species and the relationships that connect them. The future resilience of ecosystems and food systems will depend on our ability to understand, protect, and strengthen these interconnected networks of life. And that is why pollination remains one of the most important ecological processes on Earth. Let us apply systems thinking to a real pollination network. Choose a pollinator-dependent plant from your local area or from one of the examples discussed in this module. Begin by identifying the plant and the pollinators that interact with it. Next, think beyond the plant and pollinator themselves. What habitats support these organisms? What climatic conditions influence their activity? What other species contribute to the functioning of the system? Now map the relationships among these components using arrows or a simple network diagram. Finally, identify potential threats. Which relationships might be disrupted by habitat loss, pesticide use, extreme weather, or climate change? As you examine your network, ask yourself an important systems thinking question. If one species disappeared, could other species perform a similar role? Remember, resilience depends not only on the number of species present, but also on the diversity of relationships connecting them. By mapping a pollination network, you begin to see ecosystems not as collections of organisms, but as interconnected systems of relationships. Now that you have mapped a pollination network, let us explore how that network might respond to environmental change. Consider the following scenario. Imagine that your region experiences a series of unusually warm springs over the next decade. As temperatures rise, some flowering plants begin blooming earlier than they did in the past. At the same time, the emergence of key pollinators changes more slowly. Using the network you created in the previous exercise, identify the relationships that might be affected. Which plants could experience reduced pollination? Which pollinators might encounter fewer food resources? Could other pollinators compensate for the loss of these interactions? Now think beyond the immediate effects. How might reduced pollination influence plant reproduction, seed production, biodiversity, or agricultural productivity? Could these changes affect other species within the ecosystem? This exercise illustrates an important principle of systems thinking. Environmental disturbances rarely affect only one component of a system. Instead, their impacts often spread through networks of relationships, creating ripple effects that influence many interconnected parts of the ecosystem. As you work through the scenario, focus not only on individual species, but also on the relationships linking them together. Remember, resilience depends on the ability of ecological networks to absorb change while continuing to function. Your task is to identify where the network remains resilient and where it may become vulnerable. Before moving on, take a few moments to test your understanding of the concepts covered in this module. As you work through these questions, focus not only on remembering facts, but also on understanding the relationships among the ideas we have discussed. Think about pollination as a network rather than an isolated event. Consider how biodiversity contributes to resilience, how interaction diversity strengthens ecological systems, and how climate change can disrupt the relationships that support pollination. If you find any question challenging, revisit the relevant concepts and ask yourself how the different components of a pollination network interact. The goal of this quiz is not simply to assess recall, it is to reinforce systems thinking and help you connect ecological processes with broader outcomes such as biodiversity, food security, and ecosystem resilience. Pause the video if needed, complete the quiz, and then continue to the summary of key concepts. You have now completed the core content of this module. Before moving on, take a few moments to assess your understanding of the key concepts we have explored. Pause the video and answer the questions on the following slides without referring to your notes if possible. As you work through the quiz, focus on understanding the relationships among plants, pollinators, climate, and ecological networks. Remember that the central theme of this module is systems thinking. Try to think beyond individual species and consider the connections that make pollination systems resilient. When you have completed the quiz, continue to the next section for a review of the key concepts. Pause the video and answer the first 5 questions. These questions focus on the fundamental concepts introduced in this module, including pollination networks, ecological resilience, interaction diversity, and phenological mismatches. Take your time and think carefully about the relationships involved in each answer. Now complete the remaining questions. These questions focus on climate change, ecological relationships, food security, and systems thinking. As you answer, consider how the concepts introduced throughout the module connect to one another. When you have finished, proceed to the next slide for a summary of the key concepts and takeaways from this lesson. Before we conclude, let us review the key concepts from this module. Pollination is far more than the transfer of pollen between flowers. It is a fundamental ecological process that supports plant reproduction, biodiversity, agriculture, and food security. We learned that pollination systems are best understood as ecological networks composed of plants, pollinators, habitats, climatic conditions, and countless ecological interactions. The resilience of these networks depends on diversity, redundancy, connectivity, and the presence of multiple pathways through which pollination can occur. We also explored the concept of interaction diversity and saw that ecosystems often derive stability not only from the number of species they contain, but from the richness of the relationships connecting them. Climate change introduces new challenges through phenological mismatches, range shifts, and the gradual loss of ecological relationships. These disruptions can weaken pollination networks and reduce their capacity to support both natural ecosystems and agricultural systems. Perhaps the most important lesson from this module is the systems thinking perspective. The key unit of analysis is not the bee, the flower, or any individual species. It is the network of relationships that connects them. Understanding these relationships helps us better appreciate how ecosystems function, how resilience emerges, and why protecting pollination networks is essential for the future of biodiversity and food security. Keep these concepts in mind as we move to the final reflections and takeaways from this lesson. As we conclude this module, take a moment to reflect on the broader lessons of pollination. One of the most important insights is that nature operates through relationships. A flower does not exist in isolation. A bee does not exist in isolation. Plants, pollinators, climate, habitats, and countless other organisms are connected through networks of interaction that have evolved over millions of years. We often notice individual species because they are visible and familiar. Yet, the resilience of ecosystems depends just as much on the relationships linking those species together. This systems perspective changes how we view environmental challenges. Climate change, habitat loss, and biodiversity decline are not simply threats to individual organisms. They are pressures that can weaken the ecological connections that support entire ecosystems. Throughout this lesson, we have seen that resilience emerges from diversity, redundancy, and connectivity. Healthy ecosystems are able to absorb disturbances because they contain multiple species, multiple interactions, and multiple pathways through which ecological functions can continue. Pollination provides a powerful example of this principle. The food we eat, the landscapes we value, and the biodiversity that sustains life are all connected through networks that are often invisible to us. Perhaps the most important takeaway is that protecting nature means protecting relationships as well as species. When we conserve habitats, support biodiversity, and strengthen ecological networks, we help maintain the resilience of the natural systems upon which human societies ultimately depend. In the end, pollination is not simply about bees and flowers. It is about understanding how interconnected systems create resilience, sustain life, and support the future of both ecosystems and human well-being. Let us review some of the key terms introduced in this module. Climate change refers to long-term changes in temperature, precipitation patterns, and other climatic conditions that influence ecosystems and species distributions. Coevolution is the process through which two or more species influence each other's evolution over time. Pollinators and flowering plants provide one of the most important examples of coevolution in nature. Connectivity describes the degree to which species and ecological interactions are linked within a network. Greater connectivity often contributes to resilience by creating multiple pathways through which ecological functions can continue. Diversity refers to the variety of species, functions, or ecological interactions present within an ecosystem. Diversity is a fundamental source of stability and resilience. Ecological network is a system of interconnected species and ecological relationships. Pollination systems are examples of ecological networks because they involve many interacting organisms and environmental factors. Ecological resilience is the ability of an ecosystem to absorb disturbances, adapt to change, and continue functioning despite environmental stress. Finally, food security refers to reliable access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food. Healthy pollination systems contribute directly to food security by supporting agricultural productivity and nutritional diversity. These concepts form the foundation for understanding how pollination networks function and why they are important for both ecosystems and human societies. Let us continue our review of key terms from this module. Interaction diversity refers to the variety of ecological relationships within a network. In pollination systems, it describes the many different connections between plants and pollinators. Greater interaction diversity often increases resilience by providing alternative pathways when disturbances occur. Modularity is the tendency of ecological networks to form smaller, semi-independent groups of interacting species. This structure can help contain disturbances and improve overall system stability. A network is a system of interconnected components linked through relationships or interactions. Pollination networks connect plants, pollinators, habitats, and environmental conditions into a functioning ecological system. Phenological mismatch occurs when interacting species become out of sync in their seasonal timing. For example, flowers may bloom before their pollinators become active, reducing opportunities for successful pollination. Phenology is the study of recurring seasonal biological events such as flowering, migration, breeding, or pollinator activity, and how these events are influenced by environmental conditions. Pollination is the transfer of pollen from one flower to another, enabling plant reproduction. It is one of the most important ecological processes, supporting biodiversity, agriculture, and food security. Finally, pollinator refers to any organism that helps transfer pollen between flowers. Pollinators include bees, butterflies, moths, beetles, flies, birds, bats, and many other species. Together, these concepts help explain how pollination networks function and how ecological relationships contribute to resilience within natural and agricultural ecosystems. Let us review the final set of key terms from this module. Range shift refers to the movement of species distributions in response to changing environmental conditions. As climates warm, many plants and pollinators are shifting toward higher latitudes or elevations in search of suitable habitats. Redundancy describes the presence of multiple species capable of performing similar ecological functions. In pollination networks, redundancy helps maintain ecosystem functioning when one species declines or disappears. Resilience is the ability of a system to absorb disturbances, adapt to change, and continue functioning. Resilience is a defining characteristic of healthy ecosystems and is strengthened by diversity and connectivity. Species diversity refers to the number and variety of species present within an ecosystem. Greater species diversity often contributes to ecological stability, productivity, and resilience. Systems thinking is an approach that focuses on relationships, interactions, and patterns within complex systems. Rather than examining individual components in isolation, systems thinking seeks to understand how those components work together to produce outcomes. Finally, wind pollination is the transfer of pollen through the movement of air rather than by animal pollinators. Many grasses, cereals, and temperate forest trees rely on wind pollination and play a major role in global food production. Together, these terms highlight several of the central themes explored throughout this module: resilience, diversity, adaptation, and the importance of understanding ecological systems as interconnected networks of relationships. As we move to the next module, keep these concepts in mind. They provide the foundation for understanding how biodiversity supports ecosystem functioning and how natural systems respond to environmental change. In this module, we explored how pollination supports biodiversity, agricultural productivity, and food security through complex ecological networks. We learned that resilience emerges not only from species diversity, but also from the relationships that connect species within ecosystems. We also examined how climate change can disrupt these networks through phenological mismatches, range shifts, and the loss of ecological relationships. In the next module, we will shift our focus from pollination networks to crop diversity and climate resilience. Just as biodiversity strengthens ecological systems, genetic diversity within crops can strengthen agricultural systems by improving their ability to adapt to changing environmental conditions. We will explore how crop diversity contributes to resilience, supports food security, reduces vulnerability to climate-related risks, and helps agricultural systems respond to an uncertain future. Thank you for joining this module. I look forward to continuing the journey with you in the next lesson on crop diversity and climate resilience.